Okay, we're going to get started with our shiur now. I'll just do share screen. And what I did today, I saw from some of the comments from people, I tried to answer most of the questions on my own on the sheet. So while I'm going through, you can check your answers and see whether you've gotten the right answers. Not all Chavruta questions, as you know, have correct answers or not. So I answered specifically the ones that have specific correct answers and aren't open-ended questions with different options. In any case, let's get started with our Gemara. The first thing I asked you to do was to look at the section and try to highlight where the words start, where Rava's opinion starts, where Rav Acha bar Yaakov starts. And for this, I want to go through with you how I would do this so that you can get an idea of the skills needed, how to punctuate. It's something we've been working on throughout the class. And I hope it's something that, again, punctuating a text like this, it doesn't have punctuation, it doesn't have quotation marks. Here, I specifically gave you a few quotation marks. I let you cheat a little bit, but it's a challenge. And that's why I like to try to go through most weeks when we have time to go through what are the keywords to pay attention to. So we start with Amar Rava. So that means we have Rava. I already gave you a little bit of an indication, which is there's two main opinions. So if you have that information, then you know that when does this next section start? When you get to the words Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar. Now, even if I hadn't told you that, you'd be able to see that we have here, we start with Amar Rava, and then we go to somebody else comes in and speaks. So that must be saying he's responding to the first opinion. So we have Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar. The next thing to point out is, so Rava has some sort of statement, which right now we don't yet necessarily know what it is. The question is, where does his statement end and where does the Gemara start responding? So I already told you there's going to be a question, but even if you didn't know it was a question, you would realize because the next word that you see after Rava starts, the next key word is my. And this comes with my shna. My shna means what's the difference? So my shna, how is it different? Okay, so my shna, now we're going to have my shna marror. And obviously, if we're talking about marror, there's going to have to be, how is this different from something else? So then if you go further down, you see, right, my shna marror, dichtiv, blah, 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 blah. Okay, then it says Matza nami. Now, nami is a keyword also because nami means also. So how is this different? Marror, because matzah also. And then we're going to have blah, 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 blah. Okay, so that's now. Then all of a sudden you see matzah appearing again. And we've talked about this before. When something repeats itself, often it means we're getting to something new. So now it says matzah mehadar hadar bekra, and that's the response to the question. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing. Again, I'm going through this without understanding, but I want you to see how you would take this section and try to analyze it on your own to figure out how to punctuate. Then we have Rav Acha Amar, okay? And then the next keyword is Ella, but, that's usually a question, but ha is often, but behold it says, or and it says, which is always as a question. Not always, sometimes it's just and it says, like being strong, but ha comes to be a word of strength. So if it's an Ella, ha, it's going to be something negative, right? A question. So hakti be'eret tochlu matzot. And then it says, oh, hahi mebayele, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so that's the beginning of the answer. And then you have this disalka data chamina structure, which I taught you before, which is because you might have thought, and then it ends with kamash malan. So there you have that's part of the answer has as part of this disalka data. Okay, so that's the whole structure, and that's how I would go about learning how to punctuate it. And now let's go and actually understand what it's talking about, because that really didn't help us understand what it was talking about. I want you to understand the concept of trying to punctuate. I know it's the last class, but sometimes that's the best time to highlight these things, which is what's the point of punctuating, or how can you possibly punctuate something if you don't really know what it's talking about? And I once went into someone's class and they did this. When I went to first start teaching in high school many years ago, Malka Petrokovsky had been teaching there before me. And she gave me a little bit of an intro and some good ideas about what I could do for beginners Gemara and how I could get the high school kids into it. And she had this funny thing that she put on the board, which was a total mumbo jumbo of Hebrew words that they weren't actually words. It was total nonsensical words. But you could, what she wanted to show was that you could take those words, and because of the way it works in the Hebrew language and conjugation of verbs and all that, you could figure out how to punctuate total mumbo jumbo. And it was a good lesson in learning that you can take this, and even if you don't understand it, you can try to at least grapple with it and get the structure down pat, or get what's going to be next, or how do we view this. So that's all good tips for figuring out how to learn. So Amarav. Now we'll get started with the Gemara. Matza bizman hazeh deoraita umarror de Rabbanan. So he says matzah nowadays is deoraita and marror is rabbinic. Again, what does this mean? It means that now today, okay, you get to the Seder night, in another week and a half. Do you have to eat matzah? The Torah tells you have to eat matzah this year. Do you have to eat marror? No, not by Torah law. Yes, by rabbinic law. Okay, there's a difference. It's important, but it's not by Torah law. So the Gemara says, so that's Rav. That's what he tells you, which is based on the fact that we already learned, and we're going to see this now. So the Gemara asks, but Rava, what you're saying makes no sense. Umayshna marror. Why is marror only rabbinic right now, and it's not an obligation by Torah law? Dichtiv, as it says in the verse, al matzot u'merorim. You have to eat matzah and marror. Now we're missing the beginning of this verse, which is you're supposed to eat the Pesach al matzot u'merorim. Okay, in the second part of Karitza, we'll see all sorts of verses that we're only quoting parts of them now. So what does that teach us? Bizman de'ika Pesach yesh marror. Ubizman de'leika Pesach leika marror. This, by the way, sounds like a statement, not a question. So we'll see in a minute why it's a question. So he says, when it comes to marror, it seems very connected to the Pesach, the korban, the sacrifice. So therefore, when there's a Pesach, you have to eat marror. When there's not, you don't. But what's the question? So Maishna marror, that's the case. Matza nami, also by matzah, haktiv, al matzot u'merorim. It's exactly the same. Matzah and marror should be no different. Now, Stuart, you pointed out very nicely in the chat that in the according to the Trupp, which tells you kind of where to make a break in the sentence, it says al matzot, break, u'merorim. Okay, al matzot u'merorim yuflu. Right, I'll read the whole verse to you. Sorry, where is it? It's Yud Bet. You should eat the meat that night. Sliesh umatzot. Eat it roasted and with matzah. Al mirorim yochluhu. Okay, that's how it goes with the Trupp. So it's very interesting because it's a bit of a break here. And in any case, it seems like it should be the same. So matzah nami, also by matzah, it says the same thing. So now comes the answer. Oh, there's another verse about matzah. Matzah mehadar hadar bekra. The pasuk goes back and somewhere else talks about matzah, and it says ba'erev tochlu matzah. In the evening, you should eat matzah, which seems to indicate that no, you're obligated to eat matzah independent of the korban Pesach, because it appears in a verse without having to do with the Pesach. And marror doesn't appear anywhere else. That's Rabba's approach. Okay, so here's our chart, which kind of summarizes. So you can look at the chart for a minute. So al matzot u'merorim yochluhu teaches you that you're obligated to eat marror only by rabbinic law nowadays. And ba'erev tochlu matzot is coming to teach you, but matzah is still by Torah law, even when there's no temple. Okay, I can add the word nowadays. Okay, nowadays. Okay, now the big question, and we're only going to get to this really at the second part, which is, so you have time to still think about this, is, and I'll promise you now that there's no real good answer to this question. Okay, and here, if you want to learn something methodological about this, we have this obligation to eat the korban Pesach with matzah and marror. We don't really know why. Now, last week we brought in the Bechor Shor, who said that there's this concept of eating Pesach, matzah, and marror together because the Pesach symbolizes the redemption, or let's start with the marror. The marror symbolizes the slavery. We said the matzah symbolizes the freedom. And the Pesach signifies the redemption, because that's how God redeemed us. We put the blood and he passed over the houses. That's the redemption. And it's this idea of bringing all these concepts together. That's a very nice idea. And I brought it because I really like that source. But I want to be honest and say that nobody really knows the answer to this question. Today, we're going to bring, at the end of today's class, a different suggestion as to why marror is a little bit different. Okay, and what's really, in other words, why you have to, in order to understand why marror is different, you have to understand why are we eating these all together, and why do we have to eat them if we're not together? And it's if the marror is a reflection of the slavery, then we should be doing it nowadays also, because we want to remember the slavery, just like the matzah is a symbol of freedom, and we want to remember the freedom. So this is the big question here, which is, why is there a split between these? And I'm going to tell you now that I don't have a great answer. I have a possible answer, an approach, but it's a really good question. And I'm happy at the end of class when we break for questions at the end, I'm happy to hear if people want to suggest ideas that you came up with during Chavruta. We can start the second section, to the question answer section, with hearing from other people what their ideas are about this. Okay, now comes Rav Acha. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, and what I wanted to just point out, I'm going to go back for one more second, methodologically, is that often we have mitzvot in the Torah and we don't know what the reason is for them. And all the reasons given are all conjecture. We don't really know the real reason. And here it's important to know the reason because you want to know if that's the reason, and is it that it's only supposed to be eaten together, which means that nowadays we're not really obligated. And in fact, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, that's a good lead into what he says. He says, what are you talking about? The whole mitzvah is only to eat them all together. We no longer have a sacrifice. We're no longer obligated, not in matzah, not in marror. So to which they obviously ask him, and this is why we call it a ping pong, because now we take what Rava said and we use that as a question to Rav Acha. We say, Ela haktiv, but it says, Ba'erev tochlu matzot, you have to eat matzah at night. So of course you have to eat matzah nowadays. There you have it. Matzah appears without the Korban Pesach. So the answer given is, Hahi mebayale litameh v'shaya b'derech rechokan. Now this approach is to say, that verse is coming for something else. Hahu mebayale means that is needed for some other drasha. And this is the way the world of drasha works. If you need something for one drasha, you can't use it for something else. What's a drasha? A drasha is we want to derive a halacha from here. So what does he say? But erev tochlu matzot means that if, okay, now, according to him, this verse is only referring to the time of the temple. And what it means is, if it's the time of the temple, and you're a tameh, v'shaya b'derech rechoka, either you're impure when it comes to Pesach Rishon, the first Pesach, or you were b'derech rechoka. It was actually funny over dinner. My daughter said we were talking about Pesach, and when are you home for Pesach from the army? And she says, well, I'm home for Pesach Sheni. I said, Pesach Sheni? Said, she meant the last day of Pesach. I said, that's not Pesach Sheni. What do you mean? I'm talking about that tonight, right? It's all in my head, this Pesach Sheni. What is Pesach Sheni and Pesach Rishon? It's not the first day and the last day. It's Pesach Rishon is Yud Daled Nisan, the first time, right? The first month when you're supposed to do the sacrifice of the Pesach, and then that night you eat it, which is Tet Vav at night. Pesach Sheni is for all those people. If you remember in the desert, there were some people who were impure and they said, what are we supposed to do? We can't bring the Korban Pesach. So Moshe goes to God and God tells him, oh, we'll give you another chance the next month. So on Yud Daled Iyar, which we celebrate as Pesach Sheni, some people have a custom to eat matzah. So it's for a tameh shaya b'derech rechoka. Now, what does it mean to say? It means ba'erev tochlu matzot. Even though you're not bringing a sacrifice that night, like the rest of the Jewish people are in the time of the temple, you should still be eating matzah. You might have thought, kevan de pesach lo achle matzah marror nami lo necha. What might you have thought? You might have thought, if we didn't have this verse to teach you, you might have thought that since you're not eating the Pesach, you don't need to eat matzah marror. Kamash malan. Therefore, the verse comes to teach you that you do. Okay, that's what he understands from that verse. Okay, so now if we go right, he takes his two verses, al matzot murorim. He teaches you're not obligated to eat any of these by Torah law anymore. But erev tochlu matzot is for someone who didn't bring the first Pesach. He still is obligated to eat matzah on Yud Daled b'Nisan that night. Okay, now here I gave just a review about this structure. Okay, so it's a structure of, but it says, Ela haktiv, hahu mibaya is, oh, don't worry that it says that verse and that he used that as his proof because I need that verse for something else. And then a salkadat hachamina is to tell you, well, why do I need that verse? Isn't it obvious that they have to eat matzah? Well, it's not necessarily so obvious. You might have thought, since they're not bringing it, they don't have to eat matzah. And then comes the Kamash Malan to say that's why we need it. But now we have to go back to our ping pong, because if he learns that verse by Erev Tochlu Matzot, what are we left with? Well, Rava, where is he going to learn that from? Rava Amar Lecha, Tameh v'shaya b'derech rechoka, lo tzarich kra. The Gemara is bothered right now with where's he going to learn that from? Oh, he doesn't need a verse. Why does he not need a verse? He's no worse than an arel or a ben nechal. Now, what is this? It says, Ditanya, as it says in a Braita, and it comes from a pasuk in the Torah first, Kol arel lo yochal bo. Anyone who's uncircumcised, or a Jew who's basically left the tribe, decided not to be Jewish anymore, they're not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach. Now, notice what it says in the verse. Kol harel lo yochal bo, it. So now, why didn't it just say kol harel lo yochal? Bo comes to teach you, bo eno ochel, aval ochel b'matza u'marror. He doesn't eat that, but he still needs to eat the matzah and the marror, even though he's not eating the Pesach. So Rava says, if that's true for the uncircumcised person, well, obviously then it'll be true also for the tamei and hayab derech rechoka. So I don't need a verse because I already have a verse. Okay, so he comes to say, kol harel lo yochal bo, teaches us the halacha that Rav Acha needed the other verse for. So now obviously we're going to get back to Rav Acha, and this is the last part of our section, which is, according to Rav Acha, this is where the Gemara uses this term, v'idach. When they're doing the ping pong, they don't even always bother to bring the person's name. They just say, oh, and the other, what does he do with this? So what's he going to do? Why do you need kol harel lo yochal bo? And if you have kol harel lo yochal bo, you don't need the verse that we just had, which is, you don't need be'erev. If you have be'erev tochlu matzot, you don't need kol harel. If you have kol harel, you don't need be'erev tochlu matzot. So why do you need to learn it from there? You could have just learned it from one place. Isn't it the same as Rava said? So what does he say? K'tiv b'hai, k'tiv b'hai. It's written there and it's written there, even though they seem to be the same thing. Why are they the same? Because they're both people who aren't bringing the sacrifice tonight, and yet they still have to eat matzah. So they say, utzriche, you need them both. And now, as I told you before in the intro, the Gemara doesn't tell us why there's a tzriche. And for this, we need the Rashbam. So what does the Rashbam say? Tamei b'shaya b'derech rechoka. Now, if you had that, you wouldn't be able to, or if you didn't have, we're going to start with, if you had arelu ben nechar. Lo yalef me arelu ben nechar. Why? There's a big difference between the two. You might say the arelu ben nechar need to eat matzah that night. Why? Because they don't have an option to do Pesach Sheni. They get no makeup, right? Eat le tashlumin le Pesach Sheni. In other words, the tamei and b'derech rechoka have a makeup. They're going to do it in a month from now. So maybe they don't need to eat matzah. Therefore, hilkach lo yochal matzah b'rishon. You might have thought they won't eat matzah the first time. Ad sheyaseh Pesach Sheni, and then he'll do it the proper way with the matzah, with the maror yachlu. But arelu ben nechal dinu sheyochlu b'matzah b'rishon dehalo achli b'sheni. So basically, the first part is to say, if you just had the arel pasuk, you wouldn't have been able to learn tamei v'shaya b'derech rechoka. That's why you need them both. But it always has to go in both ways. What if you just had tamei and shaya b'derech rechoka? Let's say, well, here it's a little bit trickier because they're going to do it in a little bit of a different way, which is, let's say you only had the pasuk be'erev tochlu matzot and you didn't have kol harel lo yochal bo. And then we'd say you'd have tamei b'shaya b'derech rechoka. And then obviously, if they have an option Pesach Sheni and they still have to eat matzah tonight, then also the arel and the ben nechar will. So now they say, no. Why? If you just had that verse, what would you have said? Have a mokmele ba'arelu ben nechar mishum delele tashlumin. What does that mean? It means that if you just have erev tochlu matzot, you would have assumed that must be referring to an arel and a ben nechal because they don't have a makeup, and therefore, so it's the same logic in the same direction. Therefore, you needed two verses to teach you. One is for tamei and derech rechoka, and one is for ben nechal. With that, we're going to end. We're going to have chavrutot of, because of our time, we'll do it for about 12 minutes. Okay, 12-minute chavrutot.